Thank you, everybody. And we now move over to our first plenary speaker, Mike Morecroft, Professor Mike Morecroft, who we're very privileged to have with us. Mike stepped in for Tony Juniper, who had joined us a couple of years ago. You may have remembered him, but we are absolutely not worse off having Professor Mike Morecroft. He has an outstanding record and can bring some hugely significant insights. Can I just check that we have Mike on the?
Yes,
Okay, perfect. And then I'll introduce Mike. Oh, yes, I can see Mike there. So Mike is Principal Specialist for Climate Change at Natural England. So that's the government agency in England responsible for the natural environment in England, government conservation agency. And he's also a coordinating lead author on ecosystems for the IPCC 6th Assessment Working Group 2. So his work centers on developing the science of climate change impacts, adaptation and mitigation, and applying it to conservation policy and practice. And that's what makes Mike incredibly special in this space. A man after my own heart, I might say, Mike, because for me, we can have a lot of theory devoid from practice, and we can have a lot of practice devoid from theory. And nothing good happens in those poles. Where the good stuff happens is when you're sitting right in the middle between those areas. It's the hard place to be, though, which is why it's easy to gravitate towards one or the other. But Mike, like myself, is sitting right at that intersect. So he's able to take what he understands at that research theoretical level and apply it in context. And then in his international IPCC role, connect that with what's happening globally. So in that context, I think we're incredibly excited to hear what you have to say for us, Mike, on this specialist topic of yours around climate nature intersect. Thank you, Mike.
Great. Well, thank you. That's a very good introduction, and hopefully you can hear me, and you'll shout if you can't. But absolutely, that space between the interaction of policy, practice, and science is where I spend a lot of my time. Anyway, I'm going to share my slides. Give me a moment. Oh, there we go. Okay, I think you can see that. Let me just set that in. There we go. Hopefully, can somebody just say if you can see that? I'm going to assume all is well. But, thank you. Right. Yes, so tackling the joint crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. And I'm going to start really by stepping back. I'm an ecologist, that's where my training lies, although most of my career I have worked on climate and its effects on ecosystems and biodiversity. And I want to step back to first principles just for a couple of moments. And that's the fact that nature, biodiversity as we know it, is shaped by climate. You can look at the global scale of the patterns of biomes, the large scale patterns of biodiversity around the world, whether somewhere is a tropical rainforest, a tundra, or a desert, is shaped by climate. This is a map of biomes, but it could be a map of climate. If you look a bit more locally, like this picture on the right-hand side in the English Lake District, you can see that as the climate goes cooler as you go up a mountain, you get a different pattern of where different species and habitats occur. And you can also see that that interacts with the way that people have used the land. And that in turn has gone on to shape patterns of biodiversity. So there's this tight linkage between climate, biodiversity, and people. And it works the other way too. Nature shapes climate. And you can't fully understand the global carbon cycle without understanding a bit of ecology. So yes, this is a very simplified version of the global carbon cycle and the fluxes between the atmosphere and the surface of the Earth. So the largest flux, yes, that's fossil fuels, something like 35 gigatons of going into the atmosphere as a result of people burning fossil fuels. But 11% of the total anthropogenic emissions to the atmosphere come from land use change and land use degradation, particularly deforestation, but also things like the degradation of peatlands, the drying of peatlands, and the thawing of the tundra. Now that's 11%. You might say, well, that's not that big an element of it, is it? It's important because if we're going to stop anthropogenic climate change, we're going to have to deal with it. But the even bigger influence is the way that the biosphere, the ecosystems, also affect what's taken out of the atmosphere. So at the moment, roughly a third of what we put into the atmosphere in fossil fuels is taken out by the terrestrial biosphere, and roughly another third by the global oceans. Some of that's biological, some of it's chemical. But nevertheless, you can see that the overall accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is profoundly shaped by what's happening with ecosystems. So there's no way of getting around it. The nature and climate crises are profoundly linked. And there are serious problems. Crisis sometimes sounds like a slightly melodramatic word, but I think it's a fair one. So this is work by the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, sort of scientific equivalent to the IPCC in the biodiversity space, documenting the increasing rates of extinctions, documented extinctions since 1500. And you can see for all these different groups of species, the 20th century saw a big hike in the number of species extinctions. But it's not just those global extinctions. At the population level, something like 69% on average of declines have been recorded in the populations of mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish. It's a report from WWF. And looking forward, the extinction risk in a range of different groups ranges from the worrying to the really quite alarming. So there is a threat to biodiversity right now. Now, a lot of my work has been on biodiversity and ecosystems in the context of climate. And as Victoria said, I was privileged to be one of the coordinating lead authors for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's most recent assessment report. And I was particularly involved with the one in the middle there on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, so-called Working Group 2. But they came as a trilogy. So there's the physical science basis and also mitigation options for climate change being the other ones. And then most recently this year, a synthesis report was published. But I'm going to focus mainly on the one in the middle. And just some headlines. I say headlines, these are evidence-based statements from the summary for policymakers, but human-induced climate change, and including in that extreme events like floods, droughts, wildfires, for which we have good evidence are now becoming more frequent and more severe in many cases because of climate change, has caused widespread adverse impacts, related losses and damages to nature and people. And something like half the world's population, just over 3 billion people, live in contexts, in places and situations that are highly vulnerable to climate change, which is a staggering figure. And if we reach 1.5 degrees of global warming in the near term, which is becoming a near certainty, we will see unavoidable increases in multiple hazards with risks, again, to people and to ecosystems. And these risks are becoming increasingly complex and more difficult to manage. And I'll illustrate that as we go on. So on the biodiversity side, specifically and on ecosystems, you can see the fingerprints of climate change really quite clearly now in the scientific data. So something like half of species that have been assessed in terms of their distribution, the patterns of where they occur around the world, have shifted their ranges towards the poles or towards higher elevations, tracking where cooler spaces are that they're adapted to. We've also seen biome shifts, these global patterns of vegetation and structural changes within ecosystems at an increasing number of locations. And I'll show you a figure on that in a minute. We've also seen the start of what could be quite a serious increase in global extinctions as a result of climate change. We think there are 3 documented cases where climate change is the primary cause of the loss of a species. Things like the bramble K melanis, which lost its island habitat essentially because of rising sea levels, or the golden toad, which a species of high altitudes where the warming temperatures have probably led to a decline. But we can also see changes in local populations of plants and animals. And roughly half of the species that have been assessed for that have shown that in the very hot years, you can get local population extinctions. I mentioned about changes in biomes. And again, this is a little figure, a map showing those global patterns of vegetation. And all the little symbols, and you don't need to look at the details of it, show where there's been a change at the boundary between, for example, forest and savanna, or between forest and tundra. And this isn't a prediction of what might happen. This is an observation of what's happened now, where there is a change, for example, trees expanding northwards into the tundra regions as temperatures warm. And this is the sort of thing that IPCC reports in the past projected would happen. And we're now seeing the signature of it playing out on the ground. If we play that forward into what might happen in future, we can see that the degree of impact will depend on how much the world warms. So these are 2 maps showing local biodiversity loss and proportions, and the red ones, I will point out, show that something like 75 to 100% of species being lost from a particular area. So these are quite massive impacts, and we can see at 1.5 degrees we will get those impacts in some places, but go on to 3 degrees of warming, if we were to ever get there, God forbid, you really quite catastrophic changes in many parts of the world. And I started off pointing out the interactions between climate, biodiversity, and people. And we can also see increasing evidence of how that plays out with climate change. So we can see that unsustainable use of natural resources, the fragmentation of habitats and damage to ecosystems increases the vulnerability of ecosystems, of species, habitats, and services they provide. You can see the impacts are bigger of current climate change in places that are more degraded. And we can also see that the degradation and destruction of ecosystem tends to increase the vulnerability of people too. For example, on a deforested slope, water on a hillside, water runs off more quickly in some parts of the world, including somewhere like where I live in the UK, can increase the risk of flooding downstream. And so we can see that the loss of ecosystems and their services has cascading and long-term impacts on people globally. And those impacts are especially pronounced for the indigenous peoples and local communities who are directly dependent on ecosystems. The impacts are uneven across the world. If you live in a country or in a situation where you're depending on the benefits provided by ecosystems from all around the world, then you can probably buffer yourself to some extent against these impacts. If you're very locally dependent on the situation, it's much harder. The figure on the right isn't one from our report, but it's from a recent paper in Science, and looking at the way the degradation of the Amazon forest responds to quite a complex interaction between climate change, increasing the severity of droughts periods, with forest clearance and fragmentation, and the impact on forest fires, for example, with consequences for people in the area. So it's a complicated interacting situation. And at the global scale, those interactions continue in terms of feedbacks to the global carbon cycle. So a statistic that took me aback when I first read it and still alarms me is that there's roughly 3 to 5 times as much carbon in vegetation, permafrost and soils as there is in unextracted fossil fuels. If it doesn't stay there and goes into the atmosphere, then you're getting into what sometimes called an amplifying feedback to the climate system. Climate change makes it more likely that will be released, but that in turn exacerbates climate change, and you get a vicious circle. And the kind of mechanisms through which that can happen are things like increases in wildfire, tree mortality, insect pest outbreaks that can become more common with climate change as pests are enabled to spread into places where they didn't once before, and trees don't have that sort of resistance to them. Peatlands drying up in warmer temperatures and the thawing of the permafrost. But you can see all those are prone to interactions with land use. Drainage of peatlands, for example, or deforestation. And there's also a risk of tipping points. So it isn't all about linear trends and, 1 degree of warming causes this effect and 2 degrees of warming doubles it. If you cross some thresholds, for example, a forest becoming a savanna, it's not easy to reverse that situation. So that brings us to the question then, well, what can we do? What are the solutions? And I suppose the first port of call is adaptation. How do we adapt to climate change? And within biodiversity conservation, there's a certain amount you can do to build resilience of ecosystems. And in my work for the National Conservation Agency in England, that's a big part of what we do. So protecting and restoring ecosystems can build their resilience to climate change, to the shocks that can come, for example, with a severe drought or a heat wave. There's also some evidence that we can target our protection measures in what are sometimes called refugia, places that are locally cooler, for example, on the north-facing slopes within a landscape where it's more shady. But we do also have to build adaptation into conservation planning and take account of the fact that species aren't always going to be where they were in the past, that we're not going to have the same habitats in the same places. What was once perhaps a fen might become a wet grassland. And we found there is quite a lot of evidence that people are starting to make plans and strategies, and my own organisation is one of them. But there hasn't been so much progress in actually implementing these adaptation actions. And for me, one of the real key points as well is when we do make them is that we evaluate the effectiveness of adaptation options. And it comes back to that place we started where we're trying to bring together science, policy and practice. If we work in medicine, then the idea of drug trials, for example, and testing is it's thoroughly part of medical research, and there's a challenge to get adaptation research and ecological research into that space where we're evaluating the effectiveness of our interventions. One of the concepts that's become really big in recent years, and I want to move on a little bit beyond adaptation for the sake of nature itself, is the idea of nature-based solutions. We've said that climate and nature are profoundly linked, so it makes sense to have solutions that are linked as well. And the idea of nature-based solutions is that we address societal challenges, in this case climate change, in ways that benefit people and biodiversity. And the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, has pioneered this concept for a number of years. And just last year, the UN Environment Assembly approved a definition of what nature-based solutions are and what they should look like. It's a long definition with a lot of caveats in for reasons that will become clear as we carry on, to ensure nature-based solutions are implemented in a good way, which delivers what they can do without some of the adverse impacts. But the gist of it is addressing social, economic, and environmental challenges in ways that provide human well-being, ecosystem services, resilience, and biodiversity benefits. So it's all about a joined-up approach. I'll just quickly rattle through a few examples. Big one everyone usually talks about is forests, and I would contend to be a true nature-based solutions. We're talking about natural forests with mostly native species, good for storing carbon, but can also be good for example, slowing the runoff of water off hillsides and preventing flooding downstream. So restoring those deforested slopes I mentioned earlier. Peatlands, though, really important. Some peatlands do have trees on, not all do, but they store a lot of carbon. Peat is the accumulated, undecomposed organic matter that builds up in waterlogged conditions in many places, often degraded in the more in some of the wealthier and more exploited parts of the world, including the UK, I will say, and actually restoring them is a really big and important thing to do. It restores the hydrology of a catchment and keeps carbon sequestered safely away. There's also, though, agroecological farming, using more native species, allowing space for wildlife and within a farmed landscape, measures that build up organic matter in the soil. So farming in a way that is consistent with natural processes. We can also see in the urban situation that green space within towns, green space doesn't really do it justice, but natural areas within towns can help to keep the temperature lower on a hot sunny day, partly because of shading if you've got trees, but also because of the effects of evapotranspiration. The loss of water from the surface has a cooling effect. It can also be very good for improving drainage patterns by slowing the flow of water off of the land and helping it to infiltrate into the soil. And then there's a whole large area of work around renaturalizing catchments, and particularly rivers and wetlands, to slow the flow of water downstream. For example, where rivers have been straightened in the past, you can reinstate some of the meanders, like the picture on the screen at the moment, that slow the flow. It's good for habitats for many species, both in the watercourse and also in the wetlands on the edge of it. And it provides benefits to people too. So nature-based solutions have great potential for a joined up approach and many benefits, multiple benefits. But there is increasingly a track record, unfortunately, of them being badly implemented. I suppose some of the most notorious cases have been around where we plant trees and where we should not be planting trees. In a temperate zone like the UK, with lots of raised bogs like the one here, or blanket bog in some of our upland areas, which are naturally treeless, there's in the past been efforts to drain bogs and plant trees. Any carbon that's sequestered by the trees has to be offset by the losses from that drainage activity, and also very often changing in an unhelpful way the hydrology of the catchment. But it's very interesting talking to some of my IPCC colleagues from a very different part of the world, in the savannah, and picture from South Africa. There's been a various well-intentioned but unfortunate efforts to plant trees in savanna. Savanna is naturally a very sparsely wooded habitat. Yes, there are trees, but it's not a degraded forest. It's naturally got open spaces, and planting of trees into that can cause a lot of damage to the local biodiversity, interfere with the water supply, and a number of other problems. So nature-based solutions need to be implemented well. Yes, they can deliver those benefits for adaptation and mitigation, often with multiple additional benefits, but it needs to be in the right place and with the right approach. And with inclusive governance, and that's something that came out of our IPCC work. And, you know, I'm an ecologist, it's not my area, but there's a very loud and clear message that actually, if you don't involve local people, if you don't just allow them some ownership, and don't take advantage of local knowledge, things will often go wrong. And the other final point, caveat, I suppose, around nature-based solutions is that, as we've seen, ecosystems and therefore nature-based solutions are themselves vulnerable to climate change. So it's important that they are adapted, their resilience is as high as possible, but also it's worth stating and restating that this isn't a reason to avoid cutting other emissions. And some somewhat simplistic accounts really suggest that by planting trees you can carry on with business as usual. Well, it's never going to add up to enough, and it's greenwashing, and it's devalued the currency of NBS. So it is really important we learn how to do it well. So I'm shifting gear a little bit from generalities and the global situation to look at a particular piece of work we're doing at the moment in the UK on nature-based solutions for climate change at the landscape scale. So we're trying to learn some of these lessons to do things better in future. And this is very much in that space of applied research. So it's based around pilot studies, doing actions on the ground, things that we believe will be good nature-based solutions, but then being really rigorous in evaluating that. So it's a UK government-funded project, but led by government agencies. Natural England, my organisation, leads it. I chair a steering group, and we work with our partners in some of the other agencies, the Environment Agency and Forestry Commission. We've got about £12.5 million, which is, by my standards, quite good. It's probably not compared to the total requirement for nature-based solutions and other adaptation and mitigation measures, of course. But it's a pilot study, and we have 6 pilot areas around England which are led by local partners. And they've bid into a competition to us, we've assessed them, and then we're using them as a test bed. So we have a number of different work streams there. I won't go through the detail other than to say that it, as well as the project management, includes both science, but also some work around blended funding and governance. So some of the practicalities of how you make these sort of partnerships work. Those are led by my colleagues in the Environment Agency. So I can talk a little about it, but I'm not going to dwell on it in this presentation. So our pilot sites, we were particularly interested in what we call landscape scale areas, which is over 500 hectares. Some of them are a lot bigger than that. But this isn't about rewilding a whole vast area. It's actually about how you can realistically restore and create habitats within a mixed land use. Like many Northwest European countries, we have a landscape that's a patchwork of different land uses, with agriculture mixed with small fragments of more biodiverse areas and a wide range of other different uses that are made of the countryside. So where can you actually realistically do this without jeopardizing food supplies, and in ways that those who own and manage the land and live there are happy with and want to actually be proactive about? So we're working with established partnerships This is a pilot study. We wanted to work with people who are already up and running in terms of working together, so we didn't have too long a lead in, but people with a long-term vision for an area, because all these things have to be there for the longer term. We needed access for research, and we wanted groups who are willing to explore governance and blended funding, the practicalities of making this work going forward. We were also interested in projects that delivered wider environmental and societal benefits. And this key element of evaluation was put in from the start. So the area of work I'm particularly responsible for is around establishing baseline carbon fluxes measurements, carbon storage measurements, but there's also looking at how carbon builds up over time, what we call a chronosequence approach, using habitats created at different periods in the past, and also comparing the fluxes of different habitats. And then looking at what the benefits are for biodiversity, how the species associated with new habitats compares, for example, with longer term older habitats. And we're also interested in the wider benefits and disbenefits of these actions. So that's work in progress. I'm not going to show you any results from that. It'll be a year or two before we get many. But I put it up just to put it to you that this shifting the way we do research to evaluate effectiveness and practicality of adaptation and mitigation is a necessary next step. And it's one we're starting to take. Now, I'm coming towards the end of my talk, and I just wanted to zoom back out again. It should be clear, I think, for everything I've said, that a really key element of effectively tackling the biodiversity and climate crises is a joined up approach, and not one that stands in isolation from everything else that we want to do in the terms of sustainable development. So a concept that's, that we've started to develop within the sixth assessment of the IPCC is that of climate resilient development. It's not our term, it was around, but it's not been widely used. And the idea is to try and bring together adaptation and mitigation in that wider context. So a climate resilient development should lead to a situation where the world has low emissions. We see systems transitions to make that possible, and transformation, low risks of climate, partly because of effective adaptation, partly because of actually effective mitigation measures, and then some wider concerns about equity and justice and the Sustainable Development Goal achievements. There's a very clear message that the communities that are already poor or subject of injustice are much more vulnerable to climate change. We can't really tackle those two problems independently. So there's a number of conditions which enable climate resilient development, and that includes inclusive governance, diverse knowledge and values. Not really time for me to go into it now, but we had a large piece, well, not probably large, but for the first time, the IPCC has tried to take account of local knowledge and indigenous knowledge to a significant extent. I think we've got a way to go there, but at least the process is starting. Finance and innovation are needed. Integration across sectors and timescales. What was termed ecosystem stewardship, so looking after nature better, which is obviously where my particular interests are. Looking for synergies between climate and development actions, and also behavioural change and what's necessary for that in terms of policy, infrastructure and socio-cultural factors. And this is all building up to this rather large, rather complicated diagram, but it's, if you get those conditions right, then you've got a chance of reaching that desired state of a climate resilient world. And you can see, though, there's a number of pathways, and we have choices as a global community. And one very powerful statement, which is an evidence-based statement. It's not a political statement. It's not the personal opinion of the authors, but the evidence is really clear that we now have a rapidly narrowing window of opportunity to enable climate resilient development. As global temperatures rise, you start to close off some of these options. If you fail to adapt early, you close off options. So the pathway we take is going to depend on decisions we make now going forward into the future. So within that broader context of climate resilient development, one of the other evidence-based statements that we came up with was that safeguarding biodiversity and ecosystems is fundamental to climate resilient development. And to unpack that somewhat, again, using the text from our summary for policymakers, maintaining the resilience of biodiversity and ecosystem services at a global scale depends on the effective and equitable conservation of something like 30 to 50% of Earth's land, freshwater and ocean areas, including currently near natural ecosystems. There's something about the scale. Yes, we can have locally meaningful nature-based solutions, but it's not enough without that broader global context of protection and restoration of ecosystems. And there are many lines of evidence that lead us to say that, and it's really putting together the pieces from a number of different studies. And we do seem to be getting good recognition now of this at a global level, and of the need for that large-scale protection of ecosystems. So back at the end of last year, the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was published. So this was the big Convention on Biological Diversity meeting in Montreal back in December. And that came up with a number of targets, including one which has long been discussed and argued for and advocated for, that by 2030, at least 30% of terrestrial and inland water areas, etc., are effectively conserved and managed. Now, again, it's one of these big international documents with lots of caveats and clauses, but that's the gist of it. 30% protection of ecosystems in terms of area, effectively conserved and managed. And I'm going to doubly underline effectively, because that, of course, is the challenge going forward. Words are cheap. Actually implementing them is the hard bit. So the effective conservation of land and sea and fresh waters at that scale is really an essential component of dealing effectively with both the climate and nature crises. So to wrap up with a few conclusions, climate change is a threat to ecosystems and biodiversity. Adaptation, restoration and protection of ecosystems reduces those risks to people and to nature. Nature-based solutions can contribute to adaptation and mitigation with multiple additional benefits for biodiversity and people. But they need to be done well, and they can't be used to justify delaying cuts in fossil fuel emissions. We find we need both world-class science and practical local knowledge to effectively implement nature-based solutions. And ultimately, climate resilient development requires an ambitious combination of adaptation and mitigation within those wider sustainable development goals. So just briefly acknowledge my thanks to my colleagues in Natural England and the IPCC and those who funded the work. And then I want to leave you just with this quote that again is an evidence-based statement from the IPCC report, that any further delay in concerted and anticipatory global action on adaptation mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. And when I've quoted that a lot since we published the report about just over a year ago. Some people see that as a very depressing statement, and it can be, but I'd encourage you to see the words window of opportunity. We can't avoid all the adverse impacts, but we can still avoid the worst of them. So let's seize that window of opportunity. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mike. A really very well targeted presentation for the theme of our conference. I don't know if you can see, probably blurred, you can see a number of people in the room. There are also quite a lot of people online, I think 175 in total in this conference. And I don't know if you heard me speak earlier, Mike, but I would say, especially from a sort of European academic perspective, one of the most diverse conferences that I know of, really. So we have people genuinely online and in the room who represent really the world in many ways, obviously not every single country. So it was great to hear about the diversity aspects that you emphasized there as well. And it's nice to know that we are reflecting that. So we now have time for questions. So we've got about 20 minutes for questions. So please open the floor. Do we have a microphone that's going around? Okay, yeah, that would be great. And, we're a small, community of people. So the chance to come up and have your voice heard, please do. Don't hold back. Don't be scared. It's just a podium. So please do come and get your voices. And it's also nice to stand up. So who's going to cookie card? Come. Emerging scholars, come on, cookie card. Sorry, what's the title of it? There are award-winning
emerging scholar award winners. Yes.
Well, if you'd like to come and just break the ice while other people start to think about what they want to. Sorry to put you on the spot, but hey, I'm sure you're up there.
Here they come.
Okay, great. So, Mike, we've got somebody coming up now, a Florida representative. Please do have a think about what this is about.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Magdalena Victoria Jones from Florida International University. And I'm in the international business department. So this is really an opportunity for me to learn more about this topic of climate change, because unfortunately it's not necessarily a big deal for the majority at the conferences and whatnot. But we do have the triple bottom line approach of profit, people, and planet that we are incorporating a lot in our theories today. And I guess my question is, as someone who is looking more at the profit side, what would be like the first steps that we could do in our business schools that we could teach our students and that we could incorporate to the business side of what could we add to our research that you think would be a good connection to build so that we have more of an influence on climate change in the business acumen?
Yeah, well, that's a very big area. I mean, for me, I think, and actually, I'd probably say the same in many other contexts as well as business, actually. But I think it's important to understand two elements to climate change. One is the risk, and there's no getting away from it. Climate change is a risk to almost everything we do, and obviously to some businesses more than others, those depending on natural resources, those located in vulnerable locations, for example. So we do need to understand risk, and I think we shouldn't shy away from that. But the other thing is, there are opportunities, and I'm probably not the right person to say, but the global markets have mushroomed really around carbon. It feels still quite a messy picture, if I'm honest, and not everything is really doing perhaps what we'd like it to in the way of some of the carbon markets, and that, you know, there have been a number of concerns about how meaningful some carbon credits, for example, are. So I would encourage teaching a degree of healthy skepticism about some of those, but nevertheless to engage with it, because you know, they're here now, it's happening. So I think trying to understand what is good, and I suppose also about, you know, what good green finance looks like as well. So something like the Science-Based Targets Initiative, you know, is a well-respected approach that has very high standards indeed, and you know, some of the more progressive businesses are starting to adopt. So yeah, I think there's plenty you could do there, but I would encourage that to have a balance between what the opportunity is, but also, you know, taking seriously the risks as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that's actually my specialist area, so maybe we can talk a bit later. And like you say, SBTI, and then also some even more robust approaches like the reporting 3.0 and the threshold, science-based threshold reporting that's starting to emerge. So some really interesting things there. Now, we've obviously got also, whilst there are a load of people who are joining online, not all of them, some of them are asleep, different parts of the world. So we have a selection online. I think, if I'm right, I did see something come up in the chat saying, thank you for the fascinating presentation. Was there also a question attached to that? Would the person like to come off mute and ask your question if that's what you were doing? Did you have a question? Does anyone online? I'll pause there. Does anyone online have a question? No, maybe it was just a compliment, Mike. So in the room, anybody else? Yes, please do come, both of you. Make your way up and we'll take them one by one. Ah, great, we've got three. So let's come one by one if you're okay. Yeah, just answer. Yeah, please do.
Hello, I'm Dr. Sunshine Swetnam from Colorado State University. I just want to tell you all, my heart is pounding. I'm excited to be here, but also you get nervous. And I want to encourage you to get brave and come up here and ask your questions, because that's what we're here for. And regardless, I'm a teacher by nature. I run a ski area management program and soon to run an adventure tourism program at a master's level, but I also teach ecology and measurements of the Southern Rockies at a very special mountain campus in the Central Rockies of Colorado. And I am blessed to see thousands of aspiring land managers. So Mike, thank you so much for the presentation. It was so informative, and I hope there's opportunities that we can have these presentations at our access.
I'm sure they're accessible. Yep, you'll have
okay.
access.
But so this may or may not work, but specifically to the central United States Rockies, my question is, other than carbon sequestration and water catchment, what can be done in more arid environments like the US West, Rocky Mountain regions, because the US West is notoriously becoming more and more arid, which we already have indicators like pest infiltration through the Rocky Mountain pine beetle infiltration, wildfire and floods. And I just wanted to ask the question to see if you knew something we didn't, or you could help us think about something we're not thinking about. Again, thank you so much for your presentation. So, sorry, was that in terms of the risks, or in terms of what you can do about them? I think more I'm interested in actions that can be taken to avoid going beyond the point of no return and tipping points. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think a lot depends on the the local context, as and
I'm not that familiar. I've been to California. That's probably my closest point to you. Yeah, I've been to Yellowstone. Trying to think. I mean, I think one of the big issues, certainly in a lot of the west of the USA, is around forest management and the increase in wildfires. And some of the best examples of the interaction of land management and climate risk is around that, where you can see that if without climate change, you would have still had an increase in wildfire, but it's made it a whole lot worse. And there is, there's been a massive amount of work to try and reset some of the management practices in terms of fire suppression in what would have naturally been a fire-influenced ecosystem. And preventing forest fires has done possibly more harm than good in many, if not most cases. So, that's one that certainly springs to mind. But I think, within arid catchments, I mean, almost anywhere it makes sense to use resources efficiently. And I think this is a general point. So, and it's just as true in the UK, which, is a pretty wet place for the most part, but using water carelessly, wasting water, leaky pipes, creates problems in our drought summer, for example. So if you can have, I don't know, we've in parts of the world, we've developed forms of agriculture that depend on irrigation and require taking a lot of water out of the environment. That makes you more vulnerable. So trying to find ways of using resources efficiently, I think, is a good general point almost anywhere. I mean, the other thing is, I think a more general point is to get it part of business as usual to do climate change risk assessments and when you're planning land management to take account of them. So on our own national nature reserves, they have a management plan that they review every 5 years. They now are asked to do an assessment of the climate risks, the sort of factors that might cause problems, and develop a plan, to adjust the management plan to take account of that. In our case, in some places, it's rising sea levels, but it could well be changes in water supply or reduction in snow cover. The most important thing for me is it's often about empowering land managers to make good decisions, not for me to take them for them, but to help them to make their own in a way that's informed.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Okay, we've got 2 more questions in the room. I'm just checking the chat as well. Okay, so maybe you could just fit in a brief one here before we move over to 2 other people that are in the room. We've got, how can developing economies with high poverty levels make use of nature-based solutions, since many local communities prioritize addressing their welfare needs? Another only small question for you to answer them.
Yeah. I mean, I think the principle of nature-based solutions isn't restricted to either, global south or global north situations, high poverty, low poverty. I think it's about doing things in an efficient way with multiple benefits. So in many cases, nature-based solutions are relatively cheap. So things like reforesting a hillside, to hold water back, which may be good for preventing drought as well as for preventing water shortage. Anyway, you probably can't prevent the drought, but you can hold more of the water back and so on, as well as reducing flood risk. I think the important thing is it's a local solution to a local problem with local people empowered. But, we know that lack of resources is a problem, and it is a problem that, particularly on the adaptation side, the global north has promised a lot of money that hasn't materialized for adaptation measures. So yeah.
Okay, absolutely. And I have to say, I've had many case studies over the years where you have local leaders who make clear the pathway connections between nature and what it provides and the welfare benefits. And because there's a sort of, as Mike was alluding to there, often it's the solutions, the cheapest solutions are those to protect and enhance the nature that you have. But it can sometimes take a local leader to point out those things in order to get local people involved and protecting their own space, because they can now understand the benefits. That's an issue that's suffered around the world. And the further you are from nature, the harder it is to see those connections. But I have heard of many, many fantastic projects where that has happened. The other thing I would say is it would be worth looking at the book by Jaideep Prabhu, who innovation, which is based from that Jugaad concept in India, which is essentially the innovations that happen under conditions of poverty, which put hard constraints around innovation and therefore arrive at very radical and creative solutions that are, meant to be priced for the local populations. So I'll hand over to our probably last two questions. We've got a gentleman here, and then you can just briefly say who you are and where you're from.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I am Tirtha from Nepal. I am PhD scholar at Tribhuvan University, doing a study on disaster risk management. So, so my question is like, and also I am more interested to listen from you on the correlation between disaster risk management and climate change, since when we talk about climate change, how these two sides we should look into and then connect it. And also when we do natural based solution, since that has impact, and also maybe the natural based solution we like use in one location might not work in other location, even we do exactly the same thing. So how those perspective we can connect and look into the disaster risk management perspective, since if we connect this, maybe this will have more, the adaptation or acceptance from the local community as well. So I will be interested to hear from that side. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, disaster risk management, I think, is an absolutely critical element of adaptation, as well as, obviously being essential in any climate, really. I think where the link comes is because that the impacts of climate change that we're seeing is often mediated through those extreme events like droughts or extreme rainfall events leading to landslips and so on, or wildfire. There are a number of climate related risks, and on the coast as well. Rising sea levels combined with the storm surge make everything that much worse. So I think disaster risk reduction is a key element, and that join up, there is a natural synergy between climate change adaptation and disaster risk management. In terms of, and so I suppose just to finish that point, some of that is just simply that it becomes even more important than it already is in a changing climate, and we need to understand there's no way that risk will diminish, it will get more serious. So we need to be proactive now to get good disaster risk management in all its shapes and forms in place. In terms of the nature-based solutions question and the right thing in the right place, absolutely, yes. And I think, that was my point around the trees being planted in the wrong place and so on. And I think the key element there is that combination of getting local insight and local leadership. Things have sometimes gone wrong where it's been international partners working in developing countries and not really paying much attention to, or not paying enough attention anyway, to local people, and not giving enough space for local leadership. So I think that combination of good practical science and understanding combined with local leadership and knowledge is the only real way forward with that one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. We've got one last question, which will take us to time for the break. So thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Tran. I'm from Vietnam. I'm doing a master's degree in climate science and policy at University of California, San Diego. It's a great opportunity for someone early in my career like me to meet with all these professionals who have been doing great research in this field. So my question is, regarding regarding the effective conservation that you mentioned earlier, does it only refer to sparing the land and leaving it alone, or is it also applicable for sharing the land? Like people can also do agriculture or some sustainable practices in those areas. Does it also mean conservation? I guess this is a clarification question, but it can also be an opinion question.
Yeah, good question, and one we debated quite a lot actually, and yeah, in terms of conversations with governments as well as amongst researchers. I think when we say effective conservation, I don't think we mean sort of a shared approach to the land in the sense of just small patches like, you know, in my country, field margins, so you leave, you know, a couple of meters between the edge, from the edge of the field and the crop. You know, that may be important and valuable, but that's not really conservation. But I don't think we would, well, we did talk, there are sustainable ways of people using the resources from a protected area. In you know, and you think of places like particularly with indigenous communities, places like the Amazon, you know, the places that have been protected are the best, have actually been the ones that have got indigenous populations using them in a sustainable way. And I think it can be quite a difficult distinction to make in practice, because I think you can also see in other countries where perhaps there's been a sort of a sustainable low level of land use. So within parts of Europe, for example, you can have very rich grassland areas that might have been forest once upon a time, probably were, but they've been managed with very low intensity land use. They've not been reseeded, they've not had very high stocking rates or lots of fertilizer on it, and they support a lot of biodiversity. So I think there are ways that the word effective conservation, I think, is designed to include that range from, if you like, the strict protection right through to the low intensity management. But the important thing is that the biodiversity of those places is protected in a way that works. So that word effect, there's a lot behind those words, effective conservation, and yeah, so thanks for that question. It's good to unpack that a little bit.
Thank you, and thank you again so much, Mike, for your time. It's been really enriching. We unfortunately are at time now for a break. There is a question in the chat that I wonder if perhaps while we're on break, if you have chance, Mike, you might give any thoughts that you have on that. But otherwise, so that we keep everyone to time, we'll say thanks again to you and move to our break. Thanks so much.
Thank you.